Hello, today is Saturday, March 2nd, 2013. My name is Joey Hopkins, and I will be interviewing Geoffrey Richardson. So, Geoffrey, when were you born?
Born in 1944, just before the end of the Second World War. Born in London, England, West London.
Wow. So, I guess you've answered where did you grow up. What specific area in London?
Lived in Chiswick, West London. London's a city of lots and lots of villages over the years that just grew together, so everything is connected. But it was a kind of middle-class area of West London.
Okay. What was life for people like at this time when you were first born and raised?
Lived in London up until I was 9 years old, and it was pretty dire because there was food rationing. It was just after the war. England was absolutely bankrupt. It only survived with money from the USA. It was so bad that the best meal of the week was a poached egg on mashed potatoes on a Friday. That really was the best meal.
What kind of foods were rationed?
Pretty much everything. You couldn't get any sugar, you couldn't get any meat. Unless your mother was having an affair with the local butcher, you didn't get any meat. So you just sort of struggled on through. But it was a time when, up until the age of 9, I wasn't really aware of very much other than that we were living in a small flat, sharing bunk beds with my two sisters, and not much money. Parents didn't have a car. You travelled everywhere by trolley bus and regular bus.
So these are things that affected your childhood. And so any other challenges growing up during this time?
No, I just remember...
Just the war, all the challenges from the post.
I just really remember certain things, like there was, I guess I was 7 when we had that huge, what's called a pea super, which was a smog or a fog, like you used to get in Pittsburgh, but this was in London, and it was caused because to try and get out of debt, they were selling all the decent coal abroad and burning terrible coal in the power stations. And that particular summer, the Battersea power station was thumping up clouds and clouds of dirty smoke.
Must have been harder to breathe.
Well, it was literally, it was called a pea super because it was green. And you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You put it out in front, you couldn't see it. And over 2,000 people died. It just sat there for 2 days. People would knock on your door to ask where they were because they had no clue. They were abandoning their cars. Not that there were many cars, but they were abandoning them in the middle of the street because they couldn't see where they were going.
Almost like a dust storm, except
yeah,
with
exactly.
smog.
It was smog and it just sat there. So I remember that. And I just remember catching the bus to school, and you caught public transport, and you were 7 and 8 years old. That was the way. You didn't have school buses. You just caught the local bus.
So, how were you raised as a child?
Well, it was interesting because we were being brought up at the time in the classic 1940s, early 50s family household where mums stayed home, were the housekeepers, as it were, and we would have supper, and after supper, Dad and I would go out and play cricket or soccer or whatever it was, whilst your sisters did the washing up. That's kind of what you were brought up to expect. And that was the way until probably I was leaving high school. But the system in England was you were in elementary school till you were 9, 10 or 11, and then you went on to high school, what you would call high school. But it was different there because you had two types of school, or two types of systems. You had what's called the public school system, which actually is a private system, where your parents paid, and then you had the state system. And the state system back then was divided into two types of school. You took an exam when you were 11, which was called the 11 plus, which is a little bit like the SATs now, but it was to test how smart you were. And if you passed that well enough, you went on to what was called a grammar school, and if you didn't pass it, you went on to what was called a secondary school. And that was kind of the difference between the haves and the have-nots. And if you were, you got a better education if you went to grammar school. And the grammar schools were terrific. They were state schools, but they were terrific. The secondary schools were more like bringing you up to a trade, or if you're a girl, to be a secretary rather than anything. And then that changed in the, I guess it was the 60s, the late 50s and 60s, when they suddenly they joined the two together to become what they call comprehensive schools. So there was no division, there was no more 11 plus, you just went to this larger comprehensive school.
So a traditional English boarding school, this was different from these grammar schools, or was it the same?
Different, but regular grammar school was like an American school here.
10 daily, go home.
10 daily, go home, free. Boarding school was private, and you lived in the school. And I was a boarder. I wasn't a boarder straight away because I only became a boarder when my parents had to move. Because originally, my father worked for a brewery, and they transferred him from London down to Plymouth, which is in the West Country. So I moved there with him until my mother was able to move down, and my sisters. And he and I lived in a pub called the Plymstock Inn, I remember it. And so I was a day boy until I was 14, maybe 15. And then my parents had to move back to London, and so I stayed on, but I stayed on as a boarder. So it was the school itself, probably about 20% were boarders, the rest were all day boys. And it was different. The boys ran the school, by the way.
Yeah, such jobs as what, cleaning, cooking, stuff like that?
No, we dealt with all the punishments. When you got into the 11th and 12th grade, when you were in the 11th grade, you could have been promoted to what was called a prefect. And in 12th grade, if you made that level, you could be made into what was called a senior prefect. So we all had gowns, and we literally ran the school. If you were in trouble, it was the boys that gave you the floggings or the canings.
Oh,
So it was pretty vicious, but that changed in the late 60s.
Yes. My next question is, how does this differ from modern education? I guess one is modern education, they're not allowed to hit you.
No. And literally we used to have what was called prefect meetings. And I remember when I was made a junior prefect in the 11th grade, I was given a bad class to look after. It was, I remember, 3B. And I walked in the very first day and told everyone to shut up and sit down, and somebody at the back, I have still to this day would not know who it was, blew the raspberry at me.
What's the raspberry? Okay.
Flip the finger, call it what you will. So, and I had no idea who it was, so I just called out Stanley, prefect's meeting. And that day at 11 o'clock, he came, which was a kind of recess, came to a prefect's meeting where I outlined what he supposedly had done. The senior prefect sitting around the table declared that he was going to receive 2 strokes of the cane. He could appeal it, but he knew what the game was. I mean, I had to pick somebody, and I picked him, and he took his 2, and off he went. And if I hadn't done it, I was dead. I would have been killed. I mean, as a prefect, you stood no chance. You had to kind of stamp some kind of authority, but you'd all come up through that, so you knew what was going on.
Going back to your childhood, was your family strict or lenient in comparison to today's more lenient families?
I think it was I think culturally it was tighter. I mean, we didn't have cars. There was no concept of being 16 and having a car. You literally, I mean, when I was at home, you were stuck. And it wasn't until I was 17 or maybe even 18 that actually broke away from the family and got in somebody's car and off we went at 3 o'clock in the morning. It was our way of breaking away from home, but because it was very structured up until then.
Does modern day parenting differ from your upbringing?
Completely. When we were growing up, Mum didn't go to work. Mum didn't go to work.
And I guess the gender roles are completely...
Absolutely. And when we were growing up, as I say, Dad and I would do things and the girls would do the housework. And suddenly you're leaving school at 18 and everything was different. It was just literally, suddenly, women were working, girls were working, going to college. They never went to college, they became secretaries, if anything.
Clerks.
And suddenly you did if you didn't do the washing up, you were a sexist pig. So we were actually right in the middle of the change, which was kind of difficult. But parents, during our childhood, only Dad went to work. There was no need for two people to make money so you could have 3 cars. If you were lucky, you had 1 car. Yeah. So Mum was at home and that was what was expected.
From all of your childhood wrapped up, what were some of your earliest significant memories of major events during this time? I understand a lot of the post-World War kind of memories.
Yeah, but it's difficult to remember, again, some of them because one was so young and you don't really start taking notice of what's going on in the world until you're maybe 15, 16, 17. But, we definitely knew all about how tough it was. We definitely knew the Cold War with Berlin and the airlift and all that stuff going on and the threat of nuclear war. I mean, when you're sitting in school and they're telling you that you might have 5 minutes warning and what you had to do was get under your desk as if that was going to make the slightest bit of difference. Mm-hmm. So we were all scared about the Cold War. We were all terrified of the Cuban missile crisis because we thought that was going to be the start of
World War III.
World War III. If you get a chance, you should watch the movie Dr. Strangelove, How I Won the War, which is by, I think, Stanley Kubrick with Peter Sellers in 4 different roles. Just scary as hell. But that's what it was like. Mm-hmm. And then it was one left high school and went on out into the world. All
right. Well, going out into high school and growing up a little bit more, I guess, in your teenage years, what was some of your first jobs? So, first, basic...
Teenage jobs?
Sure.
Well, I sold ice creams from a bicycle on Wimbledon Common.
You remember how much you made?
No. Nothing was cost. My first car when I was 17 cost £12, which was like $24. That's cheap. That was cheap. Yeah. It wasn't a very good car. But,
what other jobs did you work?
Well, I worked in a hotel in North Devon, in a little village called Clovelly, which if you ever go to England you should go and visit because it is built on a steep cliffside. And there can't get any cars down. It's cobble streets, and the only way to get goods and services down there is with donkeys with sleds. And I worked in a hotel called the New